For the chalice lighting this morning, we've chosen a Plutarch quote that Julie's mother, Marlene, held dear. She was very active in politics, and as a county chair, gave this quote as a handout to her executive committee. When Marlene died in 1980, Julie's father, Cliff, had it framed, and we have a copy of the framed quote at home. They are wrong who think that politics is like an ocean voyage or a military campaign, something to be done with, some particular end in view, something which leaves off as soon as that end is reached. It is not a public chore to be gotten over with. It is a way of life. It is the life of a domesticated political and social creature who is born with a love for public life, with a desire for honor, with a feeling of love for his fellows, and it lasts as long as need be. It is not simply office holding, not just keeping your place, not just raising your voice from the floor, not just ranting on the rostrum with speeches and motions. Politics and philosophy are alike. Socrates neither set out benches for his students, nor sat on a platform, nor set towers for his lectures. He was philosophizing all the time, while he was joking, while he was drinking, while he was soldiering. He was the first to show that all your life, all the time, in everything you do, whatever you are doing, is the time for philosophy. And so also it is of politics. And Marlene added, "This, I believe, what it is all about. Best regards."
Come on up. When we welcome new members, it's a seemingly simple act, putting pen to paper, signing a name, and saying welcome. And yet and still something more important happens. A commitment of hearts to heart, of joining and reconsecrating our commitment to who we are, what values we are called to, and naming and honoring new souls among us in the larger family of all souls. These people here, this is your family, your you family, whether you like it or not, they're here. But I want you to know that this church can be a home for your soul, and we will do everything to make that true.
Jen and Tony Charlevoix, they share, "We are proud to be part of such a safe and welcoming group of people. The UU Church has brought a greater sense of community and connection into our lives. We look forward to the sanctuary we find here on Sundays and the opportunities available through the church for volunteering. This is a space where we feel heard, supported, accepted, and valued. Also, where else can you hear Ripple played by a band and Come Together played on a pipe organ on Sunday morning?"
So I invite you to turn to a litany of welcome, which you should have been handed on your way in. And as you sign this membership book, I invite you to consider the names both before you, the many 150 years of names before you, and the blank spaces afterwards. So I invite the congregation to begin in the litany of welcome. We welcome you into this congregation and into the larger circle of Unitarian Universalism. We welcome your story, your identity, and the gifts that you bring. May you find here a home for your soul. Glad new members.
We gladly join you as members of this church. We will offer our gifts as we are able to the flourishing and well-being of this community and support the values of this congregation: hospitality, compassion, spiritual growth, and justice.
And all together. We covenant to travel together in this religious community. Here we may be affirmed for who we are and challenged to be our best selves. Here may we grow our souls, care for each other and the earth, nurture spiritual growth, practice justice, and together lead lives of meaning, service, and love. We bid you welcome.
Potluck. We drive to the flat on a clear November night. Stars and planets appear in the eastern sky, not yet in the west. Voices rise from the social hall downstairs. the clink of silverware and plates, the smell of coffee. As we walk into the room, faces turn to us, friendly and curious. We are seated at the speaker's table next to the town historian, a retired school teacher who is lively and precise. The table is decorated with red, white, and blue streamers and framed Time and Newsweek covers of the president just elected. Someone has tied peanuts to small branches with red, white, and blue yarn and set the branches upright in lumps of clay at the center of each table. After the meal, everyone clears food from the tables and tables from the hall. Then we go to the sanctuary where my husband reads poems from the pulpit. On the way home, we pass the white clapboard faces of the library and town hall, luminous in the moonlight, and I remember the first time I ever voted in a township hall in Michigan. That same wonderful smell of coffee was in the air, and I found myself among people trying to live ordered lives. And again, I am struck with a love for the Republic. Two flags. I have two American flags. Both were gifts. One was handmade out of colored paper by my younger child. It's a few stars shy of regulation, but nevertheless cherished. Each has its place in my home, so I can look up from time to time and remember, that's mine. That emblem wasn't handed to me by soldiers on foreign soil, wasn't handed to me at all. That flag protects and represents me only because of Ida B. Wells, Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, and countless other women who risked everything so that I could be a full citizen. Each of us who is female or non-white or without land would have been guaranteed in 1776 the same voting rights as a horse. We all owe a precious debt to our courageous Americans before us. I would like to stand up for my flag and wave it over a few things I believe in. After 225 years, I vote to retire the rocket's red glare and the bloody bandage as obsolete symbols of old glory. We desperately need a new iconography of patriotism. I propose we rip strips of cloth from the uniforms of the unbelievably courageous firefighters who rescued the injured and panic-stricken from the World Trade Center in 2001 and remained at their posts till the buildings collapsed on them. Praise the red glare of candles held up at vigils everywhere by people praying for peace. Let me sing praise to the ballot box and the jury box. What could be a more honorable symbol of American freedom than the suffragist banner, the strikers' picket, the abolitionist drinking gourd, the placards of humane protest from every decade of our forward marching history? Give me liberty now with signs of love and life.
My parents were strongly opposed to the Vietnam War. We attended demonstrations as family events. With signs in tow, black armbands, we would march the streets singing, "All we are saying, give peace a chance." When Eugene McCarthy became a candidate for president and was actively opposing to the war, my dad became a delegate and my mom an alternate to the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. I was 11 years old, left at home with teenage siblings to watch over me, kind of. As everyone did back then, we tuned in to Walter Cronkite on the evening news at 5:30, looking forward to seeing the National Convention news, but instead I was horrified to see the violence and riots that were happening at the place where my parents were. When the news ended, we waited for my mom's one long-distance call when she got back to her landline at the hotel. She assured us she was fine, not close to the riots. But then the next night at 5:30, Walter Cronkite telling us about more riots, These were bigger, spreading closer to the convention center, and again we were waiting for her call. We waited for her call. 2 more nights of fear. Well, they did remain safe. I remember when they did come home, along with peace symbols, signs, necklaces for all of us, they also brought protest signs that they picked up from the demonstration spot as they were leaving downtown Chicago. The protest signs had blood splashed on them.
Memories can be funny things, and why do some remain and others no longer retrievable? Going back in time to me is like watching a movie where 95% of the frames have been removed. Here are a few frames that remain. I don't recall my parents being politically active, not like Julie's family. I have one of those vague memories from when I was about 4.5, being present when John F. Kennedy campaigned in Fort Dodge, Iowa, where I was born. We were Catholic, and I think being at a campaign rally was motivated by the fact that he was Catholic too. Next, I recall 2nd grade and the sisters and teachers at my elementary school crying and shepherding all of us to the church across the parking lot to pray because President Kennedy had just been assassinated. My political memory bank then skips ahead 5 years to 1968, when within 2 months the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. During that same time period, 68 to 70, one of the priests at my church and school, whose name I can no longer recall, spoke one Sunday morning from the pulpit about the Black Panthers and their breakfast program. Black Panthers' free breakfast program began in Oakland, California in 1969, and within 1 year, Black Panther members were preparing and serving free breakfast to over 10,000 children across the country. I happened to be one of the altar boys that Sunday, and standing next to the priest as people exited the church, I was very surprised at the anger expressed toward him in praising this group and program. I felt proud to be standing next to him. This was one of the first instances I can recall where I witnessed a disconnect between what the faith professed and what the faithful actually did. A hazy memory, to be sure, but the actual event seems to have contributed to my view of the world these last 50 years. And I must admit, I thought we'd be further along by now.
There's an old tradition from the 1600s among the Puritans of the Sunday before any kind of election, of whatever kind of local officials it was, the sermon that Sunday would be addressed directly to the candidates that were in the pews. Often candidates running against each other would be in the same community and in the same church, and the sermon would be directed to them. And in a good nonpartisan tradition of churches, which in that time was much less about maintaining their 501c3 tax-exempt status, but more about maintaining that ethics and morals were the highest value, not a certain party or partisanship, not a certain candidate, and that is still true. The focus of the service was not about which candidate to vote for, especially if there was two running against each other, but preaching to all of the candidates about the responsibility of the office to uphold justice and the values and ethics of religious life. So I hope you're prepared. Kim Norton and John Helmers and Jim Reed, Stephanie Podolki, Greg Wright, others, write-in hopefuls. If you want to come forward, I'll just start preaching at you. Just kidding. But the thing about this idea of this separation of politics and religion, which is good in many ways, the separation of church and state to avoid a theocracy, but there's this other aspect of it where we make assumptions around it. As a Minnesotan raised as a Scandinavian Lutheran, I was raised to be what I call a fierce moderate, opposed to taking a strong position on anything at all, even feelings, I would say. How are you? I'm fine, can't complain, that's what you're supposed to say. But politics and religion can't be so easily separated, I found out more and more. People trying to live ordered lives, writes Jane Kenyon. This is what politics and religion both are about. Politics from the root word polis, or meaning city. It's how places are governed and structured together as communities. Religion from the root word religare, same root word as ligament, of how we are bound together. Both politics and religion are about how we structure community and how we live together. It reminds me of the teachings of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who wrote, "The church must be reminded that it is neither the master nor the servant of the state. It is the conscience of the state. It is the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool." He wrote, "If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal of speaking truth to power, then it will become an irrelevant social club without any moral or spiritual authority." The religious life cannot be entirely separated, removed from the life of politics. If it is, then we become nothing but an irrelevant social club with really good auction parties, I must say, but still irrelevant without any authority in the moral, ethical sphere of life. We would be ignoring the realities of the world, failing to live into a proclaimed mission of practicing justice to make the world more beautiful. To be religious and not engage with politics is to ignore that religion is about caring for people and loving thy neighbor, and politics makes a big impact on that. People trying to live ordered lives, she says. Isn't that what we strive to do? I don't know about you, but I do. Every day I wonder how I can live a more orderly life, feel more balanced, find more time for meaning and nourishment and purpose. Poet André Dubus writes, "If I were much wiser, and if I was much more patient, if I had much greater concentration, well, then I could sit in silence in my chair, and I could look out my window at a green tree and a blue sky and know that breathing is a gift, and that breathing air is breathing God." I think that's often the hope. But if you're like me, and you feel like you often try to find this balance, this beautifully balanced life where you can just sit in a chair and look out and have this sense of overwhelming gratitude all the time. But if you feel like maybe you're not able to do that 100% of the time, welcome to the club. That's most of humanity. It's this constant trying to work and find that balance of our best selves. Being able to figure out what we can do and what we can't. What we have capacity for and what we don't, what is possible and what isn't, how to balance commitment to family and to friends and community and to work, and then add in there a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. That's a whole lot to figure out. But it's often why we make time in our lives for communities or people or places that help us do that or remind us it's a good idea. We're living in some complex political times. And in some ways, it's nothing new. Forms of this complex political situation, forms of oppression and marginalization, dehumanization and subjugation of certain people and classes and genders and cultures, that's nothing new. As you've heard from this pulpit, from me and a few others that have been guests here, these words from Adrienne Marie Brown, things are not getting worse. They're getting uncovered. We must continue to hold each other tight and pull back the veil. And at the same time, there is something slightly unique and different and particularly disturbing about the current time and context of this place and this moment, at least compared to maybe a few decades ago. The overt racism and xenophobia in very public rhetoric. And in some ways, which was still part of our culture, it has seemed less socially acceptable to say those things in the past and more socially acceptable to say certain things now. Extreme mockery, disrespect from what are supposed to be diplomatic positions. There's something kind of new here, too. And if you're following politics and if you're following the news, you are probably getting a little soul weary too. Like Heidi sang to us, there's a hurting in my family. There's a sorrow in my town. There's a panic all across the nation. And there is wailing the whole world round. And the challenge is, how do we move beyond that? How do we move beyond being soul weary, soul tired, drained, pessimistic? How do we move beyond despair? And in another inverted logarithm, memory is about the ability to spin time backwards. And remember, where we are is because of the who and the what that has been and gone before us. Those who have coached us in how to live a balanced life, live a life of meaning. Those memories that Julie and Jeff shared are what guide us forward. DeRay McKesson, in his book On the Other Side of Freedom, writes, "To remember is a political act, a process that is informed by our own proximity to and away from power. We often think of politics as a grand enterprise rooted in elections and laws, but it often shows up in our homes and our communities in much more mundane ways." He says, memory serves as its own form of resistance to injustice, its own challenge to the forces that seduce us into romanticizing the past or over-celebrating progress. And each generation reckons with the past and the ways in which events from an earlier time inform the world now. He says the poll tax likely felt progressive compared to slavery. And I remember hearing my great-grandmother and my grandparents talk about the unrest following the assassination of Reverend Dr. King. I remember learning about Stonewall, and I've had to remember my relationship with America ever since. Recently, I don't know if you saw this article too, it caught my attention in Time magazine by Emory University professor Tiari Jones. Wrote an article, and the title of it is, "There is Nothing Virtuous About Finding Common Ground." To the Minnesotan in me, I was like, no, that's not right. There must be something horribly wrong with this. But the point of the article, to be clear, is not that we should demonize people different from us. Not that we should refuse to work with people from varying beliefs or values, different parties, different organizations, different religions, but rather there are some things where there is no integrity at meeting in the middle. There are some things that you have to ask, what is the middle between moral and immoral? How can you live in between, he says. His question was, what is the moral middle on slavery? Indentured servitude? And is that okay? What is the moral middle on apartheid? What is the moral middle on white supremacy? His view is that compromise is too often coming out of, a result of, conflict avoidance. Not wanting to disagree because it doesn't feel nice. And I don't know about you, but I grew up like an hour from here. I grew up wanting to be nice. I got into the ministry because I'm kind of nice. So that conflict avoidance is true and real in this culture, but in many places. But he asks, when it comes to justice, when it comes to equity, when it comes to human rights and human dignity, quite rarely can you find a place in the middle that feels just. So in our remembering of history, perhaps there are some lessons of courage, a few lessons you brought up, a few lessons I'm sure are swirling in your own minds now, lessons of calling us to our best selves even in the midst of discomfort, of finding common humanity even if we aren't meeting in the middle on some compromise of common ground, lifting up the dignity of all even in sharp disagreements. And so I am asking you, who do you remember from your own life? Who do you remember making you aware of the importance of voting? Who do you remember living with courage and being willing to work on behalf of their strong values and belief, even when it was met with fierce opposition and disdain? Who were your teachers? Who were your coaches in civic life and politics? Who helped teach you that your life is not just your own, but you are part of a community? Who helped teach you that politics and voting, especially for those with a fair amount of privilege, is not about you, it's about a communal us? That voting isn't just about how it benefits me personally and saves a few tax dollars, but it's how it benefits an entire community. So people have food and education, and people have all the things they need to survive and survive well. Who taught you that voting is one of the most important things you can do, but not the only thing you can do? That you can write and you can make art, that you can protest and that you can pray, and that you need to find whatever way you can engage that gives you meaning and makes a difference in 1,000 different ways. Who taught you that? I remember my grandfather, a Lutheran pastor who served a church just outside of Lanesboro, Minnesota. I haven't gone too far. He always taught the family in his words, when you pray, move your feet. And what that meant for him was that prayer doesn't do anything on itself. It's meant to change your heart so that you get up and act and make the world more beautiful and you love your neighbor. I remember my grandmother-in-law recalling votes in Des Moines earlier in her childhood when she was asked, do you think gay people should be able to marry? And she was 80 years old, recalling this story several years ago. She said, well, yes, of course, everyone should have their rights. No brainer. Against the teachings of her church at the time, against the feelings of many of her loved ones at the time. I remember political organizers in college, some of them quite incessant, trying to get people involved and being inspired by their passion and intention for a better world. McKesson ends with writing a letter to activists, perhaps some words that are good for all of us today before this coming Tuesday, where we fill out a prayer ballot. McKesson says, you have more power than you know, more power than they will ever want you to know. You have the strength of other people beside you, and you stand not in the shadow of those who have fought for your life, but you are in their glow, and their light is still shining. We are living dreams of our ancestors, and in their glow and shine, we must find our own inner light to be kindled, to give us courage and balance and guidance so that we know when to breathe, and we know when to yell, and we know when to pray, and we know when to protest, to remember that a love for this country often means calling it to account, naming its faults, working for and believing in what it yet could be. Maybe you know the other verses of the song. America, America, God mend thine every flaw. It is when we remember that we live for each other, and we vote for each other, and we vote for our children's children, and most importantly, we vote probably for people we have never and will never know, and for the world that they will live in. Maybe it's when we remember each other we can find a love for the Republic, even in our disdain for it at times, that we can love it enough and work and vote and protest and pray it towards its best self to keep believing that it can be better. It takes every voice, and it takes every vote, and it takes yours. The closing hymn is Lift Every Voice and Sing. It's an important hymn, an anthem in the African American tradition, and in reverence and honor for that work and our solidarity with it, we rise in body or spirit. I invite you, as you're comfortable, to join a hand next to you and place your hand over your heart and breathe deep the breath of life. When you enter the ballot box on Tuesday, which you should, or maybe you voted early, you don't vote alone. You don't enter alone. You have your teachers and your mentors of generations past that go with you. You have the children of our children who enter right in with you. It is for them, and it is for our common good that we cast our ballot in hope and in justice and in love. May it be so. Amen.